room. The sound of children breathing steadily in their sleep filled the air, while beneath the floor, the smell of gasoline had already begun to spread like a warning. Black smoke curled upward, clinging to the crooked family photograph on the wall. The smile in the picture fading behind a layer of soot. Neighbors thought it was an accident, an unexpected mishap. But behind the flames, there were deliberate hands. The house, meant to be absolute safety, where children's laughter should echo, became a death trap. Not a stranger in the dark, not an unknown figure on the street. The one who struck was the father, the husband, the man who sat at the same dinner table. If these stories leave behind in you a detail that cannot be erased, write it down below in the comments. From Derby to London, from Wales to Northampton, kitchens, living rooms, fireplaces became crime scenes. 6 small coffins placed side by side. A pair of children's shoes left on the porch. The kitchen knife on the table turned into evidence before the court. Those houses, once their doors were shut, held things no one could imagine. The only question left was, if the home itself betrays, what can we still trust? At midnight on May 11, 2012, on Victory Road in Derby, fire engines sounded, red and blue lights flashing against the front of quiet houses. In number 18, thick black smoke rose from the living room. 6 children were asleep upstairs. None escaped. Their father, Mick Philpott, stood outside in the yard, crying out, calling their names. Neighbors rushed over, believing they were witnessing a random tragedy. No one thought that his own hands had lit the fire. Philpott, 55, was already known nationwide. He had appeared on television, boasting about living with multiple women and having 17 children. With his heavy build and hollow voice, he became a strange phenomenon, both irritating and strangely fascinating to the public. Behind the cheap glare, he lived on benefits, in a cramped house with bursts of unpredictable anger. When his latest partner left, taking 5 children with her, Philpott felt his pride humiliated. In his mind, a plan formed. Stage a fire. Blame the woman who left. Then appear before the public as a heroic father. That night, after making sure the children were asleep, Philpott, together with his wife Mairead and a friend, Paul Mosley, poured gasoline along the hallway, set it alight, then ran outside. He shouted loudly, pretending to despair, while Mairead stood trembling beside him. The fire spread quickly. Smoke sealed the staircase. Firefighters forced the doors open, pulling out each small body, laying them one by one on the pavement. 6 names: Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, Jaden, Duane, all died of smoke inhalation before waking. Police at first accepted Philpott's story, but when the fire subsided, inconsistencies appeared. Traces of gasoline remained on the carpet. The back door was locked from the inside. Neighbors recalled that only days before, Philpott had spoken of teaching his ex-wife a lesson. His behavior after the funeral also drew attention. A smile when cameras pointed. Laments that sounded rehearsed. During interrogation, Philpott denied involvement, insisting the fire had been set by someone else. But his voice faltered when confronted with the detail. The upstairs windows had been left open, yet there were no signs anyone had tried to escape. Mairead, under investigative pressure, began to waver. Mosley, a longtime drinking companion, testified that it was Philpott who had devised the plan, and he had only followed. These statements, together with forensic traces, closed the circle quickly. The trial in Nottingham drew hundreds of reporters. The prosecution described Philpott as utterly self-serving, treating his children as instruments for his own schemes. When the verdict was read, life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years, Philpott remained silent, head bowed. Mairead and Mosley received lighter sentences, but none expressed remorse. In the days that followed, the Derby community quietly laid flowers outside the charred house. 6 small coffins aligned in the church, each bearing a photograph. People looked at them, asking, how could a father turn his own presence into danger for his family? After the trial closed, the house was demolished. On the old ground, a small memorial was built, a plaque engraved with the children's names. Yet the question lingered. Did the fire begin with ambition, or with the emptiness of a man? And how many other houses, behind brick walls, conceal a secret no one dares to name? The scorched walls of Derby were torn down, but the smell of smoke still lingered in the neighbor's memory. A house erased, 6 children's voices silenced forever. The father was sent to prison. But the question of betrayal within the home never closed. Not far to the west, in the mountains of Wales, another small village faced a night of loss. No fire this time, but an absence that could not be filled. A child vanished at dusk, leaving only a pair of shoes on the porch. And once again, the one who took life was a familiar face in the village. On October 1st, 2012, in the town of Machynlleth, Wales, 5-year-old April Jones stepped out of her home to play with a friend. Dusk had already fallen. The narrow street, lit only by dim yellow lamps reflecting off wet pavement. April disappeared in minutes. The last sighting was of her climbing into a dark Land Rover. The driver was Mark Bridger, 47, a solitary man who lived on the village edge, a figure the neighbors recognized. Bridger had once been a soldier, later drifting between odd jobs, never holding one for long. He lived in a small rented house, cluttered with belongings, bottles, and old papers. Few asked about his private life. In the pubs, he spoke often, but no one paid attention. No one imagined that one evening, the familiar vehicle would become the means of taking a child away. As soon as the disappearance was reported, police and villagers launched the largest search ever held in the region. More than 1,000 people joined, sweeping roads, forests, and streams. But April never returned. When police entered Bridger's house, they found the fireplace still warm with ash. Among the ash, forensic experts discovered small bone fragments, not fully burned. On the carpet, on a kitchen knife, on a door frame, were stains of blood. DNA confirmed it belonged to April. Bridger stated that he had caused an accident, that the girl had died unintentionally. He claimed he panicked and tried to deal with it. But his testimony was fragmented, inconsistent. Each time he was asked where the body had been hidden, he deflected or said he had forgotten. In reality, April's body was never found. What remained were only grey ash, dried blood stains, and the memory carried by an entire community. The trial at Mould Crown Court drew national attention. The prosecution presented evidence. Bridger had searched on his computer for material relating to child abuse and violence. Images concealed within his hard drive. The defense of an accident was quickly dismissed. In the courtroom, April's parents sat in silence, listening to the cold details about bone fragments recovered from the fireplace of the accused. The jury did not deliberate long. The result? Bridger was guilty of abduction, abuse, and murder. The sentence: life imprisonment, whole life order without parole. When the verdict was read, he did not react, only stood still, head lowered. After the trial concluded, police continued searching for the child's remains, hoping to return them to a place of rest. All efforts failed. That Christmas in Machynlleth, residents tied pink ribbons, April's favorite color, along the streets. The absence remained, impossible to fill. Bridger's house was sealed, then dismantled. No one wished to see the place where the fireplace had burned bone to ash. A white fence was erected, as though to erase the memory. But memory did not vanish. It remained in the eyes of the mother leaving court, in the silence that descended on the village each night. No body, no grave, only scattered traces and a lasting shadow. A vehicle, a fireplace, a pair of shoes left on the porch. Questions without answers. How was April killed? How long did it take? And why could a man who lived quietly in the same village, greeting others each day, commit such an act? In Machynlleth, the small village in the valley, after that evening, no one looked at one another the same way again. And fires, once extinguished, still left the smell of ash in the memory of a community. The fire in Mark Bridger's hearth had long gone out, but the grey ash and the emptiness were never filled. A child vanished forever. A community lived with silence, without answers. Sometimes, what haunts is not what is seen, but the void left behind. If there is any void that lingers in your mind, leave it in the comments. In another town, there were no shadows of mountains or the image of a fireplace, but the ordinary light of a kitchen lamp inside a small house. In the middle of an argument between father and daughter, a knife on the dinner table became the dividing line. And this time, death arrived in the briefest instant of everyday life. On February 6, 2024, in the town of Darlington, in the northeast of England, a small house on a quiet street became a crime scene. Inside, on the tiled kitchen floor, blood spread from the table legs toward the back door. Police received a call at ASM at 8 p.m. A man had stabbed his daughter. When they arrived, the father, Simon Vickers, 48, sat against the wall, holding a kitchen knife still stained with blood. In front of him, his daughter Scarlett, 14, lay motionless. Vickers' life before this held nothing remarkable. He worked simple jobs, spoke little, and lived with his only daughter after separating from his wife. Neighbors described the two as a normal family, sometimes seen shopping together, sometimes walking the dog. No one imagined tragedy would unfold inside the familiar kitchen. That evening, according to testimony, an argument broke out. Scarlett reproached her father for the restrictions he imposed. Vickers lost his composure and stood up abruptly. The kitchen knife on the counter was in his hand within seconds, a reflexive movement. A single strike, but fatal. The dialogue vanished into silence, leaving only the sound of a body collapsing onto the tiled floor. When police placed him in handcuffs, Vickers repeated the same words. "I couldn't control myself. I lost control." But in the scene report, the 20-centimeter knife was still firmly on the table, never dropped. Forensic notes recorded the wound was too precise, driven straight into the chest, inconsistent with an entirely unconscious act. In the days that followed, Darlington was shaken. A quiet town, where people still greeted each other on the street, became the focus of national news. The same question was asked again and again. How could a kitchen argument end with the death of a child? At Teesside Crown Court, Vickers stood before the jury. The defense emphasized his psychological state. Sudden anger, the claim of being out of control. The prosecution presented other evidence. A record of previous arguments. Neighbors recalling shouts from inside the house. And above all, the precision of the knife wound. Scarlett was only 14 years old, with no chance to resist. The trial lasted several days, but nothing changed. The jury concluded this was intentional killing, not an accident. The sentence, life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 15 years before parole could be considered. When the verdict was read, Vickers showed no reaction, his eyes empty, fixed on the wooden floor. After court adjourned, residents placed flowers and candles outside the house of father and daughter. A printed A4 sheet bearing Scarlett's photograph was taped to the fence, its edges curling in the wind. No one could explain how a father, after 14 years of raising his child, could end it with a single knife thrust. The kitchen remained. The wooden table, the plastic chairs, the jars of spices still in place. Everything ordinary, except for the dark patch on the floor where the blood had soaked through. In the final report, police wrote, "No evidence indicates the act was defensive. This is a case of homicide occurring in a domestic setting inside the kitchen. No fire, as in Derby. No ash, as in Wales. Only a familiar kitchen, a knife, and an absence that could not be filled. The father entered prison. The house was abandoned, and in the memory of the town, Darlington was forever tied to that evening, when an ordinary home became a life sentence. The knife in the Darlington kitchen closed with a life sentence, but the echo remained suspended in other houses. Could an ordinary family meal turn into the final moment? Not long before in London, another child had returned home after years of living with her grandparents. A small room newly painted, toys neatly arranged. Everything seemed to mark a peaceful beginning. But within her father's arms, tragedy repeated itself. Not by knife, but by a sudden burst of violence, enough to end a life permanently. On October 28, 2013, in a small house in Sutton, on the outskirts of London, the quiet living room held a scene no one wished to imagine. On the sofa lay 6-year-old Ellie Butler, motionless. Police were called later in the day when the parents reported their daughter was no longer breathing. But when medical staff arrived, they noticed something unusual. Old bruises across her body, and a head injury too severe to be called an accident. Ellie was not unfamiliar to the legal system. At just 1 year old, she had been removed from her parents after Ben Butler, her father, was accused of abuse. For years, she lived with her maternal grandparents, cared for in a safer environment. But in 2012, after a series of legal proceedings and appeals, custody was returned to Butler and his partner, Jenny Gray. That decision would later be called one of the greatest mistakes. Life inside Butler's flat was not calm. Neighbors often heard shouting, heavy objects thrown against walls, and the coarse voice of the 40-year-old man. For Ellie, the home she returned to was also the place where she endured sudden outbursts of rage. On October 28th, that rage became fatal. In a violent outburst, Butler shook his daughter with force, her head striking a hard surface. The impact fractured her skull, causing a brain hemorrhage and almost immediate death. Instead of calling emergency services at once, Butler and Gray began staging the scene. Gray, once a background actress in a television drama, read lines into the phone, calling relatives and crying that her daughter had had an accident. They cleaned, moved objects, attempted to erase traces pointing to violence. But forensic specialists quickly noted the trajectory of the injury did not match any accidental fall. The wound was the result of deliberate force. During the investigation, Butler alternated between silence and anger. He claimed he was being framed, that the legal system had always been against him. But medical evidence, together with text messages and recorded calls, closed in tightly. Gray, in recordings, revealed clear complicity, actively helping to conceal the truth. The 2016 trial, 3 years after Ellie's death, exposed the full reality. The prosecution described Butler as violent, controlling, unwilling ever to accept fault. He had not only killed his daughter in a moment of rage, but also tried to conceal it, reducing Ellie to a forgotten piece of evidence. Gray was charged with perverting the course of justice. The final sentences: Ben Butler, life imprisonment with a minimum term of 23 years. Jenny Gray, 42 months in custody. When judgment was read, Butler turned his back to the public, showing no sign of remorse. People remember Ellie's funeral, the small white coffin, covered in roses, carried away in silence. Her grandparents, who had raised her for years, sat in the front row, their faces still. For them, tragedy was not only the loss itself, but the helplessness before a system that had returned the child to the very man who ended her life. After the trial, the flat in Sutton was left empty. Inside, Ellie's room still held her toys, dolls arranged on the shelf, children's drawings taped to the wall. Everything stood as evidence of a life just resumed, extinguished instantly. No fire as in Derby, no grey ash as in Wales, no kitchen knife as in Darlington. Only a sudden outburst, a violent shake, and a small head falling limp. Evidence simple, but enough to redefine the word father. The question lingered in the courtroom and across headlines. How had the system failed when it returned a child to someone once accused? And in how many other houses do outbursts still wait to turn into permanent verdicts? The sentence for Ben Butler ended inside the courtroom, but its echo spread outward, a warning. The law does not always arrive in time to protect. A child returned home, never to walk out again. Also in England, but more than a decade earlier, another father did not stop at a single burst of anger. In a house in Northampton, he moved from room to room, leaving behind not one, but an entire family in silence. In July 2000, in Northampton, England, a house in a quiet residential area became the site of one of the most grim scenes police had faced. The resident was Philip Austin, 31, a night shift employee for a security company. Neighbors described him as reserved, polite enough, often leaving for work in the evening and returning near dawn. Few paid attention to life inside the house, where he lived with his wife Claire, their 2 young children, and 2 dogs. The marriage was troubled. Arguments were frequent, mostly about money and family responsibilities. Claire, his wife, was described as determined, making efforts to keep stability for the children. But the tension grew heavier. That evening, another argument broke out. In the kitchen, when words reached a breaking point, Austin picked up a hammer. The first blow struck Claire's head, followed by a cord pulled tight around her neck, and finally, a knife. Her body fell still on the floor, inside the home she had struggled to preserve. But it did not end there. The children, Kieran, 7, and Jade, 9, were asleep in their room. Austin entered, carrying a knife and the cord. Within minutes, both lives were gone. The dogs barked. Austin, not wishing to leave any sound, killed them as well. A house once filled with children's voices and the noise of dogs was suddenly silent. Afterward, Austin left the scene, driving away, leaving the bodies inside. For hours, no one knew what had happened. Only when a colleague reported that he had not come to work and Claire's family could not reach them did police break down the door. Inside, they found 4 bodies: the wife, 2 children, and the 2 dogs. The house appeared frozen in time. Toys scattered on the floor, dishes still on the table, everything interrupted only by death. Austin was arrested after police found him wandering, driving without direction. At the station, he said little, his voice even, as though unaware of the full weight of what he had done. But evidence required no confession. The scene was clear. The traces on his body and in the car matched everything inside the house. The 2001 trial laid bare the truth. The prosecution argued this was not a single impulsive act. The sequence, wife, then children, then dogs, revealed deliberate intent. The defense spoke of pressure, of mental breakdown, but the jury did not accept it. What they saw was a man who had chosen to erase his entire family in one night. The final sentence: life imprisonment, whole life order, without parole. When the verdict was read, Austin showed no reaction. In the courtroom, there was only the muffled crying of Claire's relatives and the silence of everyone else present. The house in Northampton was left empty, its windows closed. Passers-by saw only darkness behind the curtains. Few spoke of it, as though silence itself could erase memory. But memory remained. 2 children's beds no longer used. A family photograph taken in a park, now only a relic. Unlike the fire in Derby, the grey ash in Wales, or the knife in Darlington, in Northampton, it was a chain of cold acts, moving from room to room, leaving 4 deaths and a silence remained. The silence of a family that no longer existed. The doors of 5 houses had opened, and inside was not warmth, but a chilling void. In Derby, fire consumed children's laughter. In Wales, a hearth left grey ash. In Darlington, a kitchen knife turned a meal into a verdict. In London, a violent shake ended a life. And in Northampton, each room closed with silence. The ones who caused it were not strangers, but fathers, husband, familiar faces at the table and in family photographs. Betrayal did not come from outside the door, but was born inside the home. One fact remains. Sometimes the first signals are already there. Bruises, shouting, unease inside the house itself. Do not dismiss them. Do not remain silent. Silence can become complicity with tragedy. The question still hangs. If the safest place can turn into a crime scene, where can trust remain? If there is any detail here that lingers with you, leave it in the comments below. And remember to subscribe, so when the next cold files are opened, you will be the first to hear the truths still hidden in silence.